Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. We've got a seriously fascinating broadcast to unpack today. Our goal right now is to step back and neutrally analyze the highly structured arguments presented in the May 15th, 2026 broadcast of Fox News, The Ingraham Angle. Because honestly, whether you agree with the politics or not, understanding exactly how these media narratives are constructed is incredibly valuable. We're going to look at how this specific episode weaves global diplomacy, economic data, and domestic critiques into one cohesive worldview. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We're going to hit the Trump-Xi summit first, then we'll look at trade and global leverage, shifting geopolitical targets, domestic political critiques, and finally wrap up with some viral political moments. Section 1. The Trump-Xi Summit, Diplomatic Optics, and the Art of the No Deal. So the broadcast framed this absolutely high-stakes meeting in Beijing not as a capitulation, but as stabilization through strength. And to build this narrative, they really zeroed in on the leader's physical vibes. They painted Donald Trump as confident, relaxed, genuinely friendly. Xi Jinping, on the flip side, he was framed as super bureaucratic, all business, and completely lacking personal warmth. The show used this stark contrast to argue that America was basically operating from a position of total comfortable dominance. And they actually went deep into these subtle, physical power plays. It's kind of wild. They analyzed everything down to the seat cushions. Commentators pointed out this forced perspective tactic, noting Trump was seated in a visibly lower chair than Xi during a bilateral meeting. They framed that as a classic dominance trick. Then they highlighted this split-second moment where Trump gives Xi's hand a slight swat, interpreting it as a deliberate countermove. It's a really fascinating look at how tiny micro-movements are broadcast as massive macro strategy. Moving on to Section 2, Trade and Global Leverage, Anchoring Policy in the Numbers. Shifting from the psychology of diplomacy to the cold hard numbers of international trade, the host really anchored her claims of American leverage in specific data. Just looking at the year-over-year stats, Chinese exports to the U.S. plummeted from $438.8 billion in 2024 down to $308.4 billion in 2025. The broadcast used this massive, nearly 30% drop as concrete evidence that heavy tariff policies are squeezing the Chinese economy hard, supposedly leaving warehouses overflowing and factories sitting completely idle. The show also dug into a reported Chinese order for 200 Boeing jets. And just to put the sheer scale of that deal into perspective, $440 million. That's the price tag for just one single Boeing 7779 jet. But the host was super skeptical about this, warning viewers that China actually has a history of not honoring aviation agreements. The big takeaway they pushed was that talk is cheap when billions of dollars are on the line. This whole overarching thesis was perfectly summed up by guest Victor Davis Hanson. He argued that the U.S. holds all the cards, overwhelming economic and demographic leverage. We're talking a superior GDP, true energy independence, and this booming AI sector, all while China faces a shrinking population. The broadcast message is crystal clear. America is in the driver's seat. And because of that, leadership can afford to be cordial without giving up an inch of leverage. All right, Section 3, Shifting Geopolitical Targets, Pressuring Beijing's Allies. The show then logically tied that Beijing summit into a much broader look at U.S. foreign policy maneuvers. Guest Peter Schweitzer walked through what he described as a systematic, chronological dismantling of Chinese influence. Point 1, Venezuela, framed as a once close ally to China that's now been neutralized. Point 2, Iran, who they described as being totally on its back heels militarily right now. Which brings us to point 3, Cuba. The broadcast identified Cuba as the absolute current focal point of American strategic pressure. And the strategy in Cuba, well, it revolves around an exact figure, $100 million. According to the broadcast, the CIA director traveled to Havana and offered this huge sum in humanitarian aid. But, of course, there's a catch. The show stressed this aid is strictly contingent on the Cuban regime making fundamental structural changes. So it was framed as this highly aggressive diplomatic maneuver to pry a failing state right out of Beijing's orbit, entirely without firing a single shot. But it's definitely not a done deal, and the broadcast made sure to highlight the intense resistance to this American push. They featured a really defiant quote from a top Cuban diplomat in the U.S. who literally declared a willingness to die for the homeland rather than yield to U.S. intervention. It just underscores the incredibly high stakes and, frankly, the volatile nature of this whole geopolitical standoff as narrated by the show. So, how exactly does a broadcast pivot from the brinksmanship of global diplomacy straight into local, state level politics? Well, the transition was actually pretty seamless. They just turned that exact same critical lens they were using on foreign adversaries straight toward domestic political opponents. Which brings us to Section 4, Domestic Political Critiques, focusing on New York and California. Turning things inward, the show first took aim at New York, specifically the congressional campaign of Kennedy heir Jack Schlossberg. The broadcast took a kind of humorous but definitely sharp approach here. They detailed allegations that he was literally napping instead of calling donors, skipping out on weekly strategy meetings, and paddleboarding in the Hudson River. Oh, and there are allegations of political plagiarism thrown in there too. They framed the whole thing as a totally unserious campaign, using it as a symbol of a broader Democratic Party that they claim prioritizes online clicks over actual substantive governance. Then, the critique moved out west to California, setting up a clash of two totally competing political visions. The current progressive governance took heavy fire for reportedly spending over $4 million on cosmetic surgeries for inmates, while simultaneously jacking up gas taxes. In stark contrast to that, conservative gubernatorial candidate Steve Hilton was on the show pitching his solutions. He argued for suspending those gas taxes and aggressively ramping up offshore drilling to drive down energy costs. To really hammer home that critique of California's current leadership, Hilton laid out some highly specific allegations of corruption against his Democratic opponent, Javier Becerra. The broadcast highlighted claims that Becerra siphoned campaign funds to supplement federal salaries, made questionable $10,000 a month payments to his chief of staff's wife, and even dismantled HHS fraud units while serving as health secretary. The show actively used these points to paint a picture of a political establishment that is both corrupt and completely out of touch. Finally, Section 5, Viral Political Moments, Pop Culture, and Friday Follies. Proving that modern political commentary definitely doesn't exist in a vacuum, the show closed out with its Friday Folly segment. First up, they covered a wild late-night TV stunt where Stephen Colbert actually brought back David Letterman just to drop a television off the CBS roof. But, even here there was a political angle. The host used this specific moment to critique Letterman, arguing that he was the original guy responsible for injecting divisive politics into the late-night comedy scene in the first place. And finally, to end on just a completely eclectic note, the broadcast shared this lighthearted story about NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. He was spotted happily eating spicy sausage and noodles right out on the street, surrounded by a crowd. It's this quick, fun, palate-cleansing anecdote that really showcases the show's unique mix. Intense political analysis followed right up by relatable pop culture moments. And that pretty much brings us to the end of our breakdown. So, by framing international diplomacy as this leverage-driven business deal where America holds all the cards, and then contrasting that with scathing critiques of domestic opponents' competence, we really have to ask, how does a broadcast like this fundamentally shape its viewers' definition of what American leadership should actually look like? It's absolutely a question worth keeping in mind the next time you tune into any news broadcast. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep asking those questions, and I'll catch you next time.